I found a note in my dead mother's pocket that said, "Come to my grave in exactly 3 months." And when I went, everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be a lie. My name is Caroline. 3 months ago, I buried my mother, Elizabeth Fletcher, 56 years old. High school literature. She died suddenly on a Tuesday morning while grading essays. No warning, no goodbye. The day before her funeral, I was helping my dad sort through her things. That awful task, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to bury her in. I was folding her favorite navy blazer when my fingers brushed against something stiff in the inner pocket. An envelope. Cream-colored, sealed. My name in cursive. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a single piece of her monogrammed statement. Caroline, come to my grave exactly 3 months after alone, 3 p.m. Trust me, my love. It's about your real inheritance. Real inheritance? My mother was a teacher. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house. We took road trips instead of vacations. She drove a 7-year-old Honda. What inheritance? I showed the note to my dad. He stared at it, face pale, before saying, "I have no idea what this means, sweetie. Your mother had her secrets, I suppose?" That cold feeling started in my stomach. Maybe I never really knew her at all. For 3 months, that note haunted me. I'd pull it out at night, reading it over and over. I Googled her name obsessively, called distant relatives, even hired a genealogist. Nothing. Until today. Today is exactly 3 months since we buried her. June 15th, Saturday, 2:47 p.m. I'm standing in front of her grave with my heart pounding so hard, I can hear it in my ears. The cemetery is nearly empty. Me, endless rows of headstones, and summer heat shimmering off the grass. I feel insane. What am I expecting? Treasure map? A ghost? But my mother wasn't dramatic. She didn't play games. If she left me this message, there's a reason. So I'm here. Waiting. And I'm about to find out what my mother couldn't tell me while she was alive. This is going to be a long story, probably the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. And honestly, I need someone. If you want to see how this unfolds, stick with me. I promise you won't believe. At exactly 3 p.m., a man in an expensive charcoal suit appeared behind me. I didn't hear him coming. 1 second I was alone, staring at my mother's headstone, and the next, there was this presence. This tall, silver-haired man with a leather briefcase and eyes that looked like they'd seen 1,000 secrets. My whole body went rigid. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, attorney at law. Said he'd been my mother's lawyer for 25 years, that she'd specifically instructed him to meet me here, at this exact time, this exact 25 years. I'd never heard his name, but never seen him at the house, never heard my mother mention having a lawyer at all. The first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. Robert told me we needed to talk somewhere private, somewhere we wouldn't be overheard. He suggested his office downtown, but I was too shaken, too suspicious. So we ended up at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the cemetery, one of those places with exposed brick and indie music playing too loud. I ordered nothing, just sat across from him, hands clenched in my lap, while he opened that leather briefcase with the kind of careful precision that made my stomach knot. He pulled out a thick folder. Legal documents, photographs, things that looked old, important. And then he said the words that made my entire world tilt sideways. He told me my mother wasn't just Elizabeth Fletcher, high school teacher from suburban Connecticut. That was only half the story. The half she wanted me to... Her real name, her birth name, was Elizabeth Ashford. I remember laughing. Actually laughing, because it sounded absurd. My mother, with a secret name, like some character in one of the novels she taught. But Robert didn't smile. He just slid a birth certificate across the table. There it was. Elizabeth Margaret Ashford. Born in Manhattan, 1969. Parents listed as Margaret and William Ashford. The paper felt cold in my hands. He explained that my mother came from old money. Not just comfortable, not just well off. The Ashfords were industrial magnates. Steel, railroads, real estate. The kind of family that had buildings named after them. The kind that appeared in history books. When my mother was 20 years old, she walked away from all of it. Changed her name legally, cut off contact with her entire family, built a new life from scratch with my dad, who she met in a bookstore in Boston and who knew nothing about her past. She became a teacher, lived simply, deliberately, and she never told anyone, not even him, not even me, who she really was. My throat felt like sand. I managed to ask why. Why would someone run from that kind of privilege? Robert's expression darkened. He said that was a conversation for another, that there were things about about my mother's that were painful, things she'd wanted to protect me from. But then he said something that made my blood run. He told me that my maternal grandmother, Margaret Ashford, a woman I'd never met, never even knew existed, died last. And because my mother was an only child, and because I was my mother's, that made me the sole heir to the entire Ashford estate. I felt the coffee shop sounds, the hissing espresso machine, the chatter, the music, all faded into white noise. Robert kept talking. Numbers, legal terms. But all I could focus on was one phrase he kept repeating. $83 million. That's what I'd inherited. From a grandmother I'd never met. From a family I didn't know I had. $83 million. I looked down at my hands, still wearing my mother's silver ring, the one she never took off, and felt something inside me crack wide open. My mother had lived in a 3-bedroom house. She'd clipped coupons. She'd taught other people's children for 30 years. And all that time, she'd been an heiress. Robert told me he had more to explain, documents to review, decisions to make. But he could see I was in shock, so he suggested we meet at his office on Monday morning. I nodded, not really hearing him. He packed up his briefcase, stood, and said one more thing before leaving. He said my mother had left me a letter, a long one, sealed, with instructions that I could only read it after our first meet. He placed a cream-colored envelope on the table between us, identical to the one I'd found in her blazer pocket. He left me sitting there, staring at my mother's handwriting on the front. The second letter, the one that would explain, but I couldn't open. Not there. Not yet. Because I already knew, deep in my bones, that once I read whatever was inside, there would be no going back to the person I was this morning. The daughter who thought she knew her mother. The woman who thought she understood her own life. I took the letter home, put it on my kitchen counter, and stared at it for 3 hours. That envelope held and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I opened my mother's letter at 2 a.m. Couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. That cream envelope sat on my counter like a bomb, and finally I just ripped it open with shaking hands and a glass of wine I hadn't touched. Her handwriting filled 4 pages, front and back, dense, careful cursive that looked exactly like the grocery lists she used to leave on the fridge. But the words were nothing like grocery lists. She started by saying she was sorry. Sorry for the lies, sorry for the secrets, sorry for leaving me to discover all of this after she was gone. She said she'd planned to tell me everything on my 30th birthday, had it all mapped out, the conversation we'd have, the explanations she'd give. But the aneurysm didn't care about her plans. Then she told me about her childhood, about growing up in a Fifth Avenue penthouse with nannies and private tutors, and parents who measured love in trust fund deposits. She described her father, William Ashford, as cold and calculating, a man who saw people as assets or liabilities, nothing in between. Her mother, Margaret, was worse, cruel in subtle ways. The kind of woman who'd criticize my mother's weight at 12, her friends at 15, her dreams at 18. Who told her that Ashford women didn't have careers? They had marriages and charity galas and appearances to maintain. My mother wrote that she felt like she was suffocating, that the money, the expectations, the constant performance of being an Ashford was crushing her from the inside out. So, at 20, she did the unthinkable. She walked away, changed her name, enrolled in a state college under her new identity, met my dad in a bookstore where she was working part-time, built a completely different life. She wrote that the years with us, with Dad, with me, were the happiest of her entire life. At every humble moment, every modest meal, every road trip in that old Honda was worth more than every dollar she'd left behind. I was crying by page 3. Ugly crying, the kind where you can't catch your breath. But then the letter shifted. She said that 2 years ago, private investigators had tracked her down. Her mother, Margaret, was dying of cancer and wanted to reconcile. Wanted to see her daughter one last time. My mother refused at first, said she'd made peace with her choice and didn't want to reopen those wounds. But then Margaret made her an offer through the lawyers. If my mother would come see her, just once, Margaret would establish a trust in my name, her granddaughter's name. A trust that would activate upon Margaret's death and my mother's death. My mother agreed. Not for herself, for me. She flew to New York. Spent 3 days with Margaret in that massive penthouse, now filled with medical equipment and hospice nurses. And during those 3 days, Margaret told her things, only secrets. Things about the Ashford fortune that made my mother's blood run cold. That's when the letter got terrifying. My mother wrote that the Ashford money wasn't, that my great-grandfather had built the empire through ruthless, sometimes illegal means. Price fixing, bribes, exploiting workers in ways that would make headlines if anyone ever investigated properly, and that some of those practiced quietly into the next generation. Margaret confessed all of it on her deathbed, like she was unburdening her soul before facing whatever came next. My mother wrote that she almost walked away again, almost told Margaret to keep her blood money. But then Margaret said something that changed everything. She said there were documents, ledgers, records hidden in a safety deposit box that proved everything, and that if those documents ever came to light, they'd destroy what was left of the Ashford. That's why Margaret wanted to give the fortune to me, someone outside the family's toxic circle, someone who might actually use it. But she warned my mother that there were others who'd kill to keep those secrets buried. Family members, business partners, people who'd built their entire lives on the Ashford legacy and wouldn't let some estranged heiress's daughter ruin it. My mother ended the letter with a warning wrapped in hope. She wrote that the money was mine now, that Robert Chen had been instructed to transfer and proper, but she also said I needed to be careful, that I should trust Robert. He'd proven his loyalty to her for over 2 decades. And then she wrote something that made my hands freeze. Caroline, if anyone from the Ashford family contacts you, cousins, distant relatives, business associates, do not trust them. Do not tell them about the documents Margaret mentioned. Robert knows where they are. He'll give them to you when he believes it's safe. Use them wisely. Use them to do what I never had the courage to do. Make the Ashford name mean something good. The letter ended with, I love you in handwriting that got shaky toward the end, like she'd been crying while writing it. I sat on my kitchen floor until dawn, that letter clutched against my chest. My mother hadn't just left me, she'd left me a mission and a target on my back. The next morning, Sunday, I did what any paranoid person would do. I started digging. I Googled the Ashford family, found their Wikipedia page, full of sanitized history and philanthropic awards, found society page photos from charity events, found obituaries of family members going back generations, and then I found something Robert hadn't mentioned, a news article from 6 months ago. Small piece, barely 2 paragraphs, in a business journal. It reported that Margaret Ashford's estate was being contested, that several family members were challenging the will, claiming she'd been mentally incompetent when she made her final arrangements. The article listed names, people I'd never heard of but who shared my blood. Victor Ashford, Margaret's nephew, CEO of Ashford Industries, Diane Ashford Grant, Margaret's cousin, board member of the family foundation, and others. A whole network of people who apparently thought they deserved my I screenshot everything, printed it, started a folder. Then I called Robert, got his voicemail, left a message saying I'd read the letter and we needed to talk immediately about the contested will. He called back within 20 minutes, told me not to worry, that the challenges were expected, that Margaret's will was ironclad and I was the legal heir, no question. But his voice sounded tight. Careful. I asked him about the documents, the ones Margaret mentioned, the ledgers. There was a long pause. Then he said we'd discuss that in person. At his office, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. He told me something that made my stomach drop. He said I should come alone, not to tell anyone where I was. My father, because there were people watching, people who'd already tried to contact him, asking questions about Margaret's estate, about her relationship with my mother, about whether there were any unknown heirs. He didn't say it directly, but I heard the warning underneath. I wasn't just rich now. I was in danger. I hung up and looked around my small apartment. The place I'd lived for 3 years, always felt safe, and realized everything had changed. My mother had spent 25 years running from this money, this legacy, and now I was running straight into it. The question was, would I survive it? Monday morning, I walked into Robert Chen's office building in downtown Manhattan, feeling like I was being watched. I was paranoid. A black sedan I'd noticed in my apartment that morning, and then again 2 blocks from Robert's building, wasn't a coincidence. His office was on the 40th, all glass and steel and expensive art that probably cost more than my car. His secretary, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, offered me coffee. I accepted even though my hands were already shaking. Robert closed the door behind us, drew the blinds, sat across from me with that same careful expression he'd worn at the coffee shop. And then he told me the part my mother's letter had left out. The contested will wasn't just some distant relatives being greedy. Victor Ashford, Margaret's nephew, the one running Ashford Industries, had filed an injunction trying to freeze the entire estate. He was claiming that my mother had unduly influenced Margaret during those final 3 days, that the will was fraudulent. He was also claiming I didn't exist, or rather, that there was no proof Elizabeth Ashford had ever had a child, because my birth certificate listed Elizabeth Fletcher as my mother. And legally, Elizabeth Fletcher and Elizabeth Ashford were two different people. Robert said he had documentation proving the name change, proving my mother's identity, proving everything. But Victor's lawyers were good, expensive, and they were dragging the case out, filing motion after motion, trying to find some technicality that would invalidate Margaret's will. I felt sick. This wasn't just about money. This was about erasing me, erasing my mother's entire existence. I asked Robert how long this could take. He said but he wasn't worried about when. The law was on our side. What worried him was what Victor might do while the case was. He leaned forward, voice dropping low, and told me that 2 weeks ago someone had broken into his office. Nothing was taken, at least nothing obvious. But his computer had been accessed. Whoever did it was looking for something specific. The documents. The ledgers Margaret had mentioned. Robert said he'd moved them after the break-in, that they were now in a secure location only he knew about, and that he wasn't going to give them to me until he was certain I could protect them. And myself. I wanted to argue, wanted to demand he hand over what was rightfully mine, but the fear in his eyes stopped me. This man had been my mother's lawyer for 25 years, had kept her secrets, had protected her identity even from his own staff. If he was scared, I needed to be terrified. He told me to go home, act normal, don't make any sudden changes to my life, don't talk to reporters if they called, and absolutely do not engage with anyone claiming to be from the Ashford family. I promised I wouldn't. That was a lie, because when I got home that afternoon, there was a voicemail waiting on my phone. A woman's voice, smooth, cultured, the kind of accent that screamed old money in boarding schools. She introduced herself as Diane Ashford Grant, said she was my mother's cousin, which technically made her my cousin once removed or something, said she'd heard about my mother's passing and was devastated she hadn't known in time to attend the funeral, said she'd love to meet me, get to know me, welcome me into the family that my mother had sadly chosen to. Her voice was warm, friendly, the kind of voice that made you want to trust it. But I remembered my mother's warning. And Robert's. Still, I was curious, maybe studious. So I called her back. We talked for 20 minutes. She asked about my life, my work. I'm a graphic designer, freelance, nothing glamorous. She asked about my father, how he was coping. She shared memories of my mother as a child, stories I'd never heard, riding horses at the family estate in Connecticut, summer trips to Martha's Vineyard, a life that felt like fiction. And then, casual was nothing. She mentioned that she'd been helping settle Margaret's affairs, that there was so much paperwork, so many assets to sort through, that it was overwhelming even for the lawyers. She said she'd found some old family documents, photos, things she thought I might want to see, things that would help me understand where I came from. She suggested we meet for lunch. Somewhere nice. Her treat. Just the two of us. Every instinct I had screamed no, but I heard myself saying yes. Because I needed to know what she knew, whether she was friend or enemy. We set a date. Thursday. A restaurant in Midtown, she suggested. When I hung up, my heart was racing. I'd just done exactly what Robert told me not to. But here's the thing. I couldn't just sit around waiting for lawyers to fight over my life. If these people, Victor, Diane, whoever else, were coming, I needed to understand them. Needed to see their faces. Needed to know what I was dealing with. My mother had run from this family. But I'm not my mother. The next 3 days crawled by. Tried to work. Tried to distract myself. Failed at both. I told my dad I was having lunch with a friend from college. Hated lying to him. But Robert's warnings echoed in my head. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was. Thursday arrived. I changed outfits 4 times before settling on something simple but nice. Wanted to look like I belonged in whatever expensive restaurant Diane had chosen. The place was called Le Bernardin. I had to Google it. Apparently it had 3 Michelin stars, the kind of place where a salad costs $40. I arrived 5 minutes early. The hostess led me to a table by the window. Diane was already there. She stood when she saw me, and I swear my breath caught. She looked exactly like my mother. Same cheekbones, same green eyes, same elegant way of holding herself. It was like seeing a ghost. She actually hugged me. And for a second, I let myself believe this might be real, that maybe I had family who actually cared. We sat. She ordered wine, some French name I couldn't pronounce. We made small talk. She asked about my design, interested, showed me photos on her phone of her own kids, my second cousins, teenagers I'd never met. The food kit was incredible. Probably the best meal I'd ever had. And then, over dessert, she made her move. She told me she understood this must all be so overwhelming, inheriting so much money with no preparation, no understanding of how these things worked, that the legal battles must be exhausting, especially while I was still grieving. She said Victor was just being protective of the family legacy, that he didn't really want to fight me, that this could all be resolved so much more easily. Talked. Family to family. She suggested a compromise. What if I took a smaller portion, say 20 million, and signed over the rest to the family trust? That way I'd be set for life and the Ashford legacy could remain intact. Everyone wins. $20 million. Said like it was nothing, like it was a generous offer. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This was why she'd invited me to lunch, not to welcome me, to buy me off. I kept my face neutral, took a sip of wine, and told her I'd think about it. She smiled, squeezed my hand across the table, said she knew I'd make the right choice. That family was what mattered most. But as she said it, her grip on my hand tightened just slightly, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That's when I noticed it, a small slip in her performance. She'd mentioned Victor was protective of the family legacy, but earlier, she'd said she'd been helping settle Margaret's affairs, that she'd found old documents. If Victor was challenging the will, claiming I didn't exist, why would Diane have access to Margaret's estate documents? Why would she be going through anything at all? Unless she was working with Victor? Unless this whole lunch was coordinated? Realized then that I'd just been tested. And whatever answer I gave about that $20 million offer would determine their next move. So, I lied. Told Diane I was overwhelmed. That $20 million sounded more than reasonable. That I didn't want to fight. That I just wanted peace. Her whole body relaxed. She called for the check, paid without looking at it, and hugged me goodbye outside the restaurant. Told me her lawyers would draw up papers, that we'd have this all settled within a month. I walked away feeling her eyes on my back, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd just bought myself time. They thought I was weak, easily manipulated, some naive girl who'd fold under a little pressure and a fancy lunch. But what Diane didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd just learned something crucial. She'd slipped up when she mentioned those old family documents, the ones she claimed she wanted to show me. My mother's letter had mentioned documents, ledgers, evidence of illegal activity. What if Diane had been looking for those same documents? What if that's what the break-in at Robert's office was about? They weren't just trying to steal my inheritance. They were trying to bury the truth about where that money came from. And I'd just figured out their weakness. I called Robert the second I got home from that lunch, told him everything. Every word Diane said, every smile that didn't reach her eyes, every detail about the $20 million offer. There was silence on the other end of the line. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said something that confirmed my worst suspicion. He told me that Diane Ashford Grant wasn't just a distant cousin playing peacemaker. She was on the board of Ashford Industries, had been for 15 years, and her signature appeared on dozens of financial documents related to Margaret's estate, documents she had no legal right to access while the will was being contested, which meant she and Victor were working together, probably had been from the beginning. Robert's voice got quieter, more urgent. He said I needed to be very careful now, that by agreeing to their offer, even falsely, I'd made myself look compliant, weak, and that was dangerous because weak people were easier to control or eliminate. That word, eliminate. My blood went cold. He told me not to sign anything they sent, not to meet with them again without him, and to start documenting everything. Call, every email, every interaction. I promised, but I also told him I wanted to go on the offense. I was tired of being scared. I asked him point blank, where were the documents Margaret had mentioned? The ledgers that proved the Ashford fortune was built on illegal activity? Another long pause. Then Robert said something that changed everything. He told me the documents were in a safety deposit box at a private bank in Manhattan, that Margaret had given him the key years ago with strict instructions, only open it after both she and my mother had passed, and only give the contents to me. But here's what made my heart start racing. Robert said that 3 days after Margaret died, months before my mother's aneurysm, someone had tried to access that safety deposit box. They'd shown up at the bank with forged documentation, claiming to be the executor of Margaret's estate. The bank had refused them, called Robert to verify, and Robert had immediately moved the contents to a new location. He wouldn't tell me where. Not yet. Said it wasn't safe, but he did tell me what was inside. Ledgers dating back to the 1950s. Handwritten records of bribes paid to city officials to secure construction contracts. Evidence of price-fixing schemes that violated federal antitrust laws. Documentation of an offshore account used to hide profits and evade taxes. And photographs. Pictures of my great-grandfather and grandfather meeting with known organized crime figures. The Ashford Empire wasn't just built on ruthlessness, it was built on crime. And if those documents ever became public, the family wouldn't just lose their reputation, they'd face federal investigations, criminal charges, the kind of scandal that would destroy everything they'd spent generations building. No wonder Victor and Diane were so desperate to contest the will. They weren't fighting for the money. They were fighting for survival. I asked Robert why Margaret had kept those records, not just destroy them. He said Margaret had been many things. Cold, manipulative, cruel, according to my mother. But she'd also been she'd kept those documents as insurance, leverage, a way to maintain power over the family members who might challenge. Now, that power belonged. I spent the rest of that night pacing my apartment, my mind racing. People, my blood relatives, had already broken into Robert's office, had tried to forge documents to access a safety deposit box, had sent Diane to manipulate me over expensive wine and dessert. What would they do if they knew I was planning to fight back? I needed help, real help, not just a lawyer. So I did something my mother probably would have hated. I hired a private investigator, found her online, a woman named Sharon Torres, former NYPD detective turned PI. Her website was basic, but her credentials were solid, specialized in financial crimes and corporate investigations. I called her Friday morning. We met that afternoon at a diner in Queens, far from Manhattan, far from anyone who might recognize. Sharon was maybe 50, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately made me feel safer. I told her everything. Well, almost everything. Left out some details about the documents, but gave her enough to work with. I asked her to investigate Victor Ashford and Diane Ashford Grant, find out what they were really doing, who they were talking to, whether there were any connections to the break-in at Robert's office. She quoted me a price that made me wince. But then I remembered I was about to inherit $83 million. I could afford it. Sharon said she'd start immediately, told me to expect a preliminary report within a week. But then she said something that made my stomach twist. She asked if I'd noticed anyone following me. Any strange cars? Anyone watching my apartment? I told her about the black sedan I'd seen twice. She didn't look surprised, just nodded slowly and told me to vary my routine, take different routes to work. Don't go anywhere alone at night. Consider staying with a friend for a few days. I asked if she thought I was really in danger. She looked me straight in the eye and said that people had killed for a lot less than $83 million. That night, I packed a bag and drove to my dad's house, told him I just needed company, that I'd been feeling lonely since Mom died. He was so happy to have me there, he didn't ask questions. I stayed in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters and books from high school, and tried to sleep, but all I could think about was my mother. She'd lived with these secrets for 25 years. How she'd looked over her shoulder every day, terrified that her past would catch up to her. She'd run from the Ashfords and built a whole new life to stay safe, and now I was walking straight into the fire she'd spent decades avoiding. But I had something she didn't have. I had her warning, her letter, her lawyer who'd proven his loyalty, and I had anger. My mother had died thinking I'd be safe, thinking the inheritance would be a gift, not a curse. These people, Victor, Diane, whoever else was involved, had turned her final act of love into a nightmare, and I wasn't going to let them win. Saturday morning, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 4 words. We need to talk. No name, no context. My hands started shaking. I showed it to my dad, told him it was probably a spam text. But then, my phone rang. Same unknown number. I answered. The voice on the other end was male, deep, calm in a way that felt threatening. He said his name was Victor Ashford, that we hadn't been properly introduced yet, but he thought it was time we spoke directly. My heart was pounding so. He said Diane had told him about our lunch. that he was glad I was being reasonable about this, that accepting their offer was the smart, the safe choice. The way he emphasized safe made my blood run cold. I asked him what he meant by that. He laughed. Actually laughed. Said he meant that legal battles were stressful, that they could drag on for years, that it would be such a shame if I had to spend my 20s tied up in courtrooms instead of enjoying my life. But underneath the friendly tone, I heard the threat. Sign over the inheritance or suffer the consequences. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him I knew what he and Diane were really afraid of, that I knew about the documents, the evidence, the criminal empire his family had built. But I remembered what Robert said, what my mother wrote. Don't let them know what you know. So I played dumb, played scared, told Victor I needed more time to think, that this was all happening so fast, that I wanted to talk to my father first. Victor's voice changed. He told me that involving my father would be a mistake, that this would matter. Ashford family and outsiders only complicated things. Then he said something that made my entire body go. He mentioned my dad by name, said it would be terrible if anything disrupted his quiet retirement, if he had to start worrying about his daughter's safety, if his own life became complicated by all of this. It was a threat, clear as day. Come after me, and we'll come after him. I managed to keep my voice steady, told Victor I understood, that I'd have an answer for him by the end of the week. He seemed satisfied with that, hung up with a pleasant goodbye that made my skin crawl. I sat there in my childhood bedroom, phone clutched in my hand, and realized something crucial. Victor had just made a massive mistake. He'd shown me exactly what scared him most, what he'd do anything to protect: my father. Which meant my father was leverage, not just for him, for me too. If Victor thought threatening my dad would make me fold, he didn't know me at all. Because now I knew exactly what I had. I had to take my father somewhere safe, somewhere the Ashfords couldn't reach him. And then I had to finish what my mother started. I had to burn their empire to the ground. I told my dad we needed a vacation, just the two of us. A grief trip, I called it. Somewhere to process losing Mom without the constant reminders of home. He was hesitant at first, said he had doctor's appointments, the house to maintain, his routine. But I pushed. Told him Mom would have wanted us to do something spontaneous, to live a little. That got him. He smiled. First real smile I'd seen since the funeral, and said yes. Within 48 hours, we were on a plane to Colorado. I'd rented a cabin outside Aspen, remote, beautiful, no neighbors for miles. And most importantly, no one from the Ashford family knew where we were. I'd paid cash for everything. Used a burner phone to make the arrangements, told exactly 2 people where we were going. Robert and Sharon, my PI. My dad thought I was being paranoid about privacy, thought I just wanted uninterrupted father-daughter time. He had no idea I was hiding him. The cabin was perfect. Wood beams, massive fireplace, windows overlooking mountains that made everything else feel small and far away. For 3 days, we hiked. Cooked meals together, talked about Mom, really talked, sharing memories that made us laugh and cry in equal measure. And the whole time, my phone was buzzing with messages I didn't answer. Unknown numbers, Diane's number, even a few emails from lawyers I didn't recognize, all of them wanting to know where I was, when we could finalize the agreement. Why I wasn't responding, I ignored every single one, because back in New York, Sharon was working. She'd called me the second day we were in Colorado, said she'd hit gold. Turned out Victor Ashford wasn't just CEO of Ashford Industries, he was drowning in debt. The company was hemorrhaging money, bad investments, failed ventures, contracts that fell through. He'd been using his board position to siphon funds from the family trust to cover losses. Margaret had known, had threatened to expose him right before she died. That's why Victor was so desperate to control her estate. The money I was supposed to inherit wasn't just his family legacy, it was his lifeline. Without it, he'd be bankrupt within 6 months. Sharon had bank records, emails, financial statements, all obtained through sources she wouldn't name but that I suspected weren't entirely legal. I didn't care. This was war. She'd also tracked down the person who broke into Robert's office, a private security consultant with a history of working for corporate clients who needed discreet problem solving. He'd been hired by Diane, which meant Diane was even deeper in this than I'd thought. She wasn't just helping Victor. She was actively orchestrating the attacks. Sharon asked me what I wanted to do with all this information. I told her to document everything, create a comprehensive report, and hold on to it until I gave her the signal, because I had one more piece to put in place. The night before we left Colorado, I called Robert from the cabin's landline, told him I was ready to see the documents Margaret had left me, ready to stop hiding and start fighting. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he'd been waiting for me to say that. He told me to meet him the day after I got back to New York. Not at his office, too exposed. At a storage facility in Brooklyn, Unit 447. He'd give me the key when I arrived. Inside that unit were the ledgers, the photographs, the evidence that would destroy the ash. But he warned me. Once I looked at those documents, there was no going back. Once I knew the full truth, I'd have to decide what, expose them and face whatever retaliation, or use it as leverage and negotiate my own terms. My mother had chosen to run rather than face that choice. But I wasn't my mother. I told Robert I'd be there. When I hung up, my dad was standing in the doorway of the living room, glass of whiskey in hand, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He asked if everything was okay, if I was in some kind of trouble. I almost lied, almost said everything was fine, but I was so tired of secrets, so tired of protecting people by keeping them in the dark. So I told him, not about the threats or the danger, but enough. Told him about the Ashfords, about Mom's real identity, about the inheritance, and the family trying to steal it. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he set down his whiskey and pulled me into a hug so tight I could. He said Mom would be proud of me for fighting, and that whatever I decided to do next, he'd support me. That's when I knew I'd made the right choice bringing him here. Because when we went back to New York, when everything exploded and the Ashfords realized I wasn't backing down, I'd need him safe and on my side. The war was about to begin, and I finally had all my pieces in position. We flew back to New York on a Tuesday morning. My dad went straight home. I told him to keep his doors locked, not answer calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and text me twice a day so I knew he was okay. He thought I was being overdramatic, but he promised anyway. I went straight to Brooklyn. The storage facility was one of those massive concrete buildings in an industrial area near the waterfront. Rows and rows of identical orange doors. Security cameras everywhere. You needed a code just to get through the main gate. Robert was already there, leaning against his car in the parking lot. He looked tired, older than he had just 2 weeks ago. He handed me a small silver key without saying a word. We walked to Unit 447 together. He unlocked it, pulled up the rolling door. Inside was almost empty. Just a metal filing cabinet against the back wall and a folding chair. Robert gestured for me to sit. Then he opened the filing cabinet and pulled out a banker's box. Heavy, stuffed with papers and folders and envelopes that looked decades old. He set it on my lap and stepped back. Told me to take my time, that he'd wait outside, that whatever I decided after reading through everything, he'd respect it. Then he left me alone with my family's darkest secrets. I opened the first folder, ledgers, just like my mother had said, handwritten entries in faded ink, dates going back to 1952, columns of numbers next to names I didn't recognize, but some names I did recognize. City council members, building inspectors, union leaders. Next to each name was a dollar amount and a note. Construction contract, Brooklyn project. Manhattan site, labor settlement, quiet, bribes, payoffs, all documented in my great-grandfather's careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I moved to the next folder. Contracts, legal documents outlining deals between Ashford Industries and shell corporations I'd never heard of. Except when I looked closer, I realized the shell corporations were all registered to the same address. A law office that had been shut down in the 1980s for money laundering. They'd been funneling profits offshore, hiding income, evading millions in taxes. The third folder made me feel sick. Photographs, black and white, grainy, but clear enough. My grandfather shaking hands with a man whose face I recognized from crime documentaries. A notorious mob boss from the 1960s. Another photo of the same mob boss at what looked like a family party. Ashford family party. He was sitting at a table with my grandmother, both of them smiling. There were letters too. Typed correspondence discussing arrangements and understandings and mutual benefits. Never explicitly stating what was being arranged, but the implications were obvious. The Ashfords hadn't just paid bribes to city officials, they'd been in business with organized crime. I felt dizzy, had to put my head between my knees for a minute and just breathe. This wasn't just scandal material, this was criminal conspiracy, racketeering, the kind of thing that would trigger federal investigations and destroy everyone involved. No wonder Margaret had kept these records hidden. No wonder Victor and Diane were desperate to get them. If this ever became public, they wouldn't just lose their money and reputation, they'd go to prison. And I was the only person standing between them and destruction. I kept reading, found more recent documents from the 1990s and early 2000s, showing that the illegal activity hadn't stopped with my great-grandfather's generation. Victor's signature appeared on dozens of documents, falsified inspection reports, fraudulent insurance claims, contracts with vendors that didn't actually exist, just more shell companies used to siphon money. He'd continued the family tradition, just gotten better at hiding it. And then I found something that changed everything. An envelope marked, "Do not open until my death," in Margaret's handwriting. Inside was a letter, addressed to me. My grandmother, a woman I'd never met, had written me a letter. It was dated 3 months before she died, right after my mother's visit. She started by saying she knew I'd probably hate her, that I'd judge her for the choices she'd made, the things she'd allowed to happen in the name of preserving family wealth. She said she didn't blame me. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She wrote that she'd kept these records not out of guilt or conscience, but as insurance. Protection against the family members who'd wanted to push her out, take control, declare her incompetent. She'd used the threat of exposure to maintain power until the very end. And now she was giving me that same power, but with a warning. She wrote, "Caroline, you have a choice your mother never had. You can destroy this family, or you can use the truth to control them. Either way, you'll never be safe from them. They'll come after you until one of you wins. Choose wisely." I sat in that storage unit for over an hour, surrounded by evidence of decades of crime, holding a letter from a grandmother who'd been just as ruthless as the men in her family. And I realized something. Margaret hadn't left me an inheritance. She'd left me a weapon. The question was, how was I going to use it? When I finally walked out, Robert was sitting in his car, waiting. I got in the passenger seat, closed the door, and told him exactly what I was. His eyes widened. He started to argue. Started to say it was too dangerous, too risky, but I cut him off. Told him my mother had spent 25 years running from these people, and it had cost her family, her ideas of mind. I wasn't going to run. I was going to end this, once and for all. Robert studied my face for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and asked what I needed from him. I smiled and told him to call Victor Ashford. It was time to have a family meeting. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon. Neutral ground, a conference room at Robert's law firm. Victor agreed immediately. Too immediately, like he'd been waiting for me to finally come to my senses. Diane would be there too. And their lawyers. A whole team of expensive suits ready to watch me sign away my inheritance. They had no idea what was actually coming. I spent the 3 days before the meeting preparing. Sharon delivered her full investigative report. 200 pages of financial records, witness statements, and documented evidence of Victor's embezzlement. I had copies made of everything from Margaret's storage unit. The ledgers, the photographs, the contracts, all organized in matching folders, labeled and indexed. Robert tried one last time to talk me out of it, said there were safer ways to handle this, that we could go to the authorities, let them build a case, stay out of the direct line of fire. But I knew better. The Ashfords had money and connections. They'd been evading consequences for 3 generations. A federal investigation could take years. And in the meantime, I'd be looking over my shoulder every single day. No, this had to end now. On my terms. Friday morning, I dressed carefully. Simple black suit, hair pulled back, minimal makeup. I wanted to look calm, professional, unthreatening. I wanted them to underestimate me one last time. My dad called before I left, asked if I was sure about what I was doing. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. He said Mom would be proud. That made me cry, but I fixed my makeup and headed out. The law firm was in Midtown, 40th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The kind of place designed to intimidate. Robert met me in the lobby, squeezed my shoulder, told me he'd be right beside me the whole time. We rode the elevator up in silence. The conference room was massive, polished mahogany table that could seat 20 people. And at one end, already seated, were Victor and Diane. Victor stood when I entered. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit. He looked exactly like the society page photos I'd found online. Distinguished, powerful. The kind of man people automatically deferred to. He smiled and extended his hand, told me he was glad we could finally meet properly, that family should always come first. I shook his hand. It was cold, firm, a businessman's handshake designed to establish dominance. Diane was warmer, gave me a hug and a kiss on the cheek, asked how my father was, said we should all have dinner together sometime soon. Play at being a real family. Their lawyers, 3 of them, nodded politely but said nothing. We all sat. Victor at the head of the table, naturally. Diane to his right. Me across from them with Robert beside me. Victor started talking immediately about how pleased he was that I'd decided to be reasonable, how this was the best outcome for everyone. He had papers ready, the settlement agreement transferring most of Margaret's estate to the family trust in exchange for my $20 million. All I had to do was sign. One of the lawyers slid the document across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out my own folder, set it on the table in front of Victor's smile faltered slightly just for a second. I looked him straight in the eye and said I had a counter-proposal. The room went very quiet. I opened my folder, pulled out the first page, a photo of my grandfather with the mob boss, slid it across the... Diane gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Victor's face went white, then red. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. I pulled out another document, the ledger pages showing the bribes, slid those across, too. Then the contracts with the shell corporations, the falsified inspection reports with Victor's signature, the evidence of his embezzlement from the family trust. Each page I revealed, Victor's expression got darker, more dangerous. Finally, I pulled out Sharon's investigative report, the proof that he was bankrupt, that he'd been stealing to cover his losses, that without Margaret's estate, he'd lose everything within months. I laid it all out like cards in a poker game, and I was holding a royal flush. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Told them here's how this was going to work. I would accept my full inheritance, every penny of the $83 million. The contested will would be dropped immediately. Victor would resign from Ashford Industries, Diane would resign from the board, and they would both sign agreements never to contact me or my father again. In exchange, I wouldn't release these documents to the federal authorities, wouldn't send copies to the press, wouldn't destroy the Ashford name and send them all to prison. The evidence would stay sealed, as long as they left me alone. It was exactly what Margaret had done, using the truth as leverage instead of a weapon. Victor stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He was shaking with rage, started to say something, probably a threat. But his lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent in his ear. The lawyer had seen enough. He knew exactly what kind of evidence I had, and he knew I had them cornered. Diane was crying, mascara running down her face. She kept saying it wasn't supposed to be like this, that they were family, that I was supposed to just take the money and go away. I felt nothing watching her cry. She'd tried to manipulate me over wine and expensive food, had probably helped plan the break-in at Robert's office, had threatened my father. She didn't get to play victim now. Robert pulled out new documents, settlement agreements he'd drafted based on my instructions. Everything I demanded, written in legal language that would stand up in court. He told them they had 24 hours to sign. After that, I'd take everything to the FBI. Victor finally found his voice. It was low, dangerous. He said I had no idea what I was doing, that there were powerful people who wouldn't let this stand, that I'd made a terrible mistake. I stood up, gathered my folders. Only mistake was his. He'd assumed I'd be easy to control, that I'd be grateful for scraps, that I'd be too scared to fight back. But I was Elizabeth Ashford's daughter, and she'd spent 25 years teaching me to be strong, even if she'd never told me why I'd need to be. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, left them sitting there with all their secrets spread across the table. Robert caught up with me at the elevator, said he'd never been prouder to represent anyone in his entire career. I made it to the lobby before my legs started shaking, before the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what I'd just done hit me. I'd gone to war with one of New York's oldest families, and I'd won. But Victor's final words about powerful people who wouldn't let this stand. The battle was over, but something told me the war wasn't quite finished yet. They signed the agreements. All of them. Victor, Diane, every board member who'd been involved in contesting the will. Within 18 hours, Robert had every signature, every notarized document, every legal guarantee I demanded. The Ashford family chose survival over pride, chose keeping their secrets buried over fighting a battle they knew they'd lose. The inheritance was officially mine, all $83 million. No more legal challenges, no more threats. It was over, except it didn't feel over. Not yet. For 2 weeks after that meeting, I barely slept. Kept expecting something to go wrong. A lawsuit. Another threat. Some final retaliation from Victor or Diane or whoever else I'd humiliated. But nothing came. Sharon did one final sweep. Checked for surveillance, traced phone records, monitored the Ashfords' activity. They'd gone completely quiet. Victor had resigned from Ashford Industries just like I'd demanded. Diane had stepped down from the board. They'd retreated into their mansions and private clubs and pretended I didn't exist, which is exactly what I'd wanted. But somehow, the silence felt more unsettling than the threats had. My dad asked me once if I felt guilty, if I regretted exposing the family, taking everything they thought belonged to them. I told him the truth. I didn't feel guilty at all. These people had built their empire on corruption and crime, had maintained it through intimidation and manipulation. My mother had run from them for 25 years because she knew what they were capable of. And when I'd inherited what was rightfully mine, they'd tried to steal it, tried to threaten me and my father into submission. They deserved everything they got. But here's what I didn't expect. The inheritance didn't make me happy. Don't get me wrong, having money solved problems. I paid off my student loans in one afternoon, bought my dad a new car because his was older than mine, set up a trust so he'd never have to worry about retirement. But every time I looked at my bank account, all I could see was my mother's face, her careful cursive on those letters, her choice to walk away from this exact money because she knew it was poison. She'd given up her family, her name, her inheritance, to live a simple, honest life. And now I had the wealth she'd rejected, the legacy she'd tried to protect me from. It felt wrong. That's when I remembered the end of her letter. The part where she'd written, "Use this money to do the good they never." 3 months after that meeting, almost a year to the day since I'd found that first note in my mother's pocket, I established the Elizabeth Fletcher, not the Ashford Foundation, not even the Caroline, the identity she'd built for herself. The foundation's mission was simple: provide full-ride scholarships to first-generation college students, fund community libraries in underserved areas, support public school teachers with grants for classroom supplies and professional development. Everything my mother had valued. Everything she'd dedicated her life to. I hired a small staff, rented office space in a building nowhere near the Ashford Industries headquarters, started reviewing applications from students who reminded me of the kids my mother had taught. Smart, driven, dreaming of lives bigger than their circumstances. The first year, we gave out 20 scholarships, built 3 libraries, supported 500 teachers across the state. It still felt like barely making a dent in the $83 million, but it felt right. Felt like I was finally doing something my mother would approve of. I went to visit her grave on the anniversary of that first meeting with Robert, brought flowers, sat on the grass next to her headstone for over an hour, told her everything. About the foundation, about facing down Victor and Diane, about choosing to use the money instead of running from it like she had. I told her I understood now why she'd left, why she'd changed her name and built a new life. The Ashford family was toxic. The money was tainted, but I also told her I'd found a way to clean it, to transform something built on corruption into something that might actually help people. And I told her I forgave her for the secrets, for not preparing me, for leaving me to figure all of this out alone. Because in the end, she had prepared, just not in the way either of us expected. She'd taught me to value integrity over wealth, kindness over power, over convenience. Those lessons were what saved me when the Ashfords tried to manipulate and threaten me. They were what gave me the strength to fight back instead of folding. My mother had given me something far more valuable than $83 million. She'd given me a moral compass. And the courage to use it? As I sat there in the cemetery, sun warm on my face, I realized something else. I wasn't just Elizabeth Ashford's daughter, or Elizabeth Fletcher's daughter. I was Caroline. Just Caroline, a woman who'd inherited a complicated legacy and chosen what to do with it, who'd faced down threats and won, who'd turned blood money into something good. My mother had spent 25 years running from her past, but I'd stopped running, faced it head on, and come out the other side. That was her real inheritance, not the money, the strength. I wiped my eyes, kissed my fingertips, and pressed them to her headstone. Then I got up and drove to the foundation office. We had scholarship applications to review, libraries to build, teachers to support. I had work to do, good work. the kind that would make my mother proud. And for the first time since finding that note in her pocket, I felt at peace. The Ashfords never contacted me again. As far as I know, they're still living their privileged lives, just quieter now, less visible. Victor rebuilt his reputation somehow. Rich people always do, but I don't think about them anymore. I think about the scholarship recipients who email me photos from their college graduations, the teachers who send thank you cards saying our grants changed their classrooms, the library openings where kids walk in with wide eyes, seeing shelves full of books for the first time. That's my legacy now, not the Ashford name, not even really the Fletcher name, just the work, the good I can do with resources most people never get. My mother was right. Money doesn't buy happiness, but it can buy opportunity, hope, change. That's exactly what I plan to keep doing with it. So that's my story. The strange, painful, ultimately hopeful journey from finding a mysterious note to inheriting a fortune to building something that matters. If you've been following along from wherever you are, thank you. Thank you for listening, for being here through all of it. I'd love to know, where are you hearing this from? What city? What state? Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing there are people out there who understand what it's like. And if you want to follow more stories, maybe not as dramatic as mine, but real and raw and honest, subscribe to this channel. You never know what you might hear next. Thanks for being part of my story. It means more than you know.